which was really serving as, I guess you call the prime mover behind a ballot initiative in California called the Comprehensive Pension Reform Initiative. That implemented what I think are probably the most far-reaching and ambitious reforms to public employee pensions that have been enacted anywhere in the country, something really far beyond what a lot of other cities and states have really even considered doing, and certainly what they've been able to enact. Looking around the country, I've done considerable work on public employee pensions, on the financing, the accounting side of things. By their own admissions or by their own accounting disclosures, public pensions nationwide are underfunded by close to $1 trillion. If you use the accounting standards that most economists and government agencies think are appropriate, the underfunding is somewhere $3 to $4 trillion. So you have a pretty significant financing issue. And this applies in cities and states across the country. So it is not something that is isolated to San Diego, although San Diego had a sort of unenviable reputation for being ahead of the trend in terms of pension financing issues. But it's something where I think there's lessons that can be learned for cities and states across the country. So I'm really happy to have Carl here. He's going to talk about his experiences and his thoughts with pension reform, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. Carl, thanks very much for coming.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you all for coming this morning. The nation rightfully is focused on fiscal cliffs and debt ceilings, but we cannot overlook a third fiscal challenge facing the country, which is the pension tsunami. And that's going to hit state and local government. In many areas of our country, it's already hit. But because we don't have a transparent and fully disclosed picture on many of these pension systems, this pension tsunami is still underneath the water. You cannot see it yet in some communities. In areas like California and San Diego, in bankrupt cities like Vallejo and San Bernardino and Stockton, you see that tsunami has hit, and you see some of the devastation. But this is a growing crisis. It's getting worse with each and every day, and it requires immediate action by not only state and local officials, but there is an appropriate and important role for the Congress and the federal government to play as well. So this morning I'm going to talk about what is the problem. What is the problem with state and local government pensions? Second, we're going to talk about the San Diego model. What did we do? I'd be happy to talk about how we did it, but I want to really focus on the way in which we tackled our pension crisis and were able to really put in place a system that we believe is very sustainable while dealing with the accrued debt, the liability that the city had built up over many years that threatened to push the city into bankruptcy. And then finally, I want to talk about specific reforms that the Congress can consider that would help clear the way for reform and would help protect taxpayers as we're dealing with this issue. As Andrew mentioned, the size of the current unfunded pension debt in state and local government for these pensions is roughly $3 to $4 trillion. To put that into perspective, you would have to pass 5 to 6 tax bills that we passed on January 1 in the U.S. Congress to generate enough money over the next 10 years to pay off this debt. 5 to 6 of those bills would have to be passed. A significant burden to taxpayers. Now, when you look at this, it's not just the total amount of debt, it's the impact to communities. And across the country, you can identify cities, counties, school districts, and states that have had to enact massive cuts in services to their residents. And I'm talking about not just neglecting infrastructure maintenance and seeing streets and sidewalks and storm drains fall apart. I'm talking about closing schools, closing libraries, closing fire stations. Severe impacts to neighborhoods across the country. Now, in most cases, the word pension doesn't really come up. They just say we have a budget deficit. And either you raise your taxes or we have to make these tough decisions. It's really a false choice. Either raise taxes or gut and cut the quality of life services that all of our neighborhoods require. The real issue is we have to reduce costs. And the number one cost driver in the municipal and state budgets has been and continues to be benefits for government workers. It's not just the salaries. That's really not the issue. I mean, that's gone up, and there needs to be reform there. It's the explosive growth in the cost of benefits. And pensions, of course, is the largest chunk of those benefit costs. And as I mentioned, there are many municipalities that have decided that bankruptcy is the only way to tackle this issue. And a lot of people predicted bankruptcy for San Diego. And when we put together our reform agenda, that's where I started. I called lawyers into the office right after I got sworn in. And I said, I've looked at the books. We cannot financially sustain the course we're on. Walk me through bankruptcy. How would it go? What's the process? What standards or tests do we have to meet? And the lawyers went through and they said, well, you can do this, you can do that, you have to put together a reorganization plan. But at the end of the day, when we got to pensions, they said, oh, we have to skip over that because the law puts pension liabilities as the number one debt to be satisfied. So many of you may know San Diego. We've got beautiful treasures, Balboa Park being one of them, Mission Bay being one of them, Torrey Pines Golf Course. If anyone wants to have a great round of golf, go to Torrey Pines. These are all city assets. So the bankruptcy lawyers were saying the judge would force you to sell those assets and deposit all the dollars, all the funds into your pension system before he would even consider touching the benefits. And there's never been a process for addressing the benefits. So very quickly we backed out of the bankruptcy discussion and said, are there legal ways for us to reform pension benefits? And the answer was a resounding yes, which surprised a lot of people. And that was one of the major challenges I had to overcome, was the false assumption that these benefits are set in stone and cannot be changed, that the law provides an ironclad guarantee and that you just have to accept your fate of higher taxes and lower services because you got to pay up. There's no change that you can make in these pension benefits. What the San Diego model proved, if anything, is that you can reform vested pension benefits in a very powerful way. Now let's talk first about what is the problem. There are three challenges that we're facing in pensions. First, the benefits are simply too high. Second, government officials are cooking the books. And third, government employee unions and defenders of pensions are abusing the law. And I want to talk about each of those three challenges as we're defining the problem. In terms of benefits being too high, you look across the country and we see in these public sector pension programs absurdly low retirement ages. Retirement at age 50 and 55 has become the standard in state and local government. I know many working taxpayers who can't even anticipate retiring at age 65 or 70 because they're not as confident in their savings at this point in their stock portfolio. But in government, we're setting the retirement ages at 50 and 55. The benefits are high because of the multipliers. Public safety, 3% at 50. Blue-collar, white-collar workers, 2.5 at 55. This is a formula that takes every single year that you've worked, multiplies that by the multiplier, 2.5 or 3%, and then multiplies that times your final compensation. For many years, there was an average of final compensation that was used. Now we're going with the highest 1 year compensation, the high watermark. And that's led to a number of abuses in the system where these government employees in some systems work absurd number of overtime hours, if overtime is counted. But in a lot of cases, they're getting promotions for a temporary period of time to get that base salary increased. They're taking on specialty pays, add-on pays, bonus pays in that final year to spike that last 1 year high water mark. And then that becomes the basis of the calculation for their lifelong pension benefit. The formula allows that sort of abuse. So what we're finding are some pretty outrageous pension payouts. In the state of California, the top 10, just 10 state and local employees, collectively this year will cash $3 million worth of pension checks amongst 10 people. Over the next 25 years, these 10 individuals, just 10 people, will collectively cash over $55 million in pension checks. 10 people, 55 million. You would have thought that they pooled their money and bought a lotto ticket, and they all won on that one ticket, so they're splitting the proceeds. $55 million. In California, there's the top pension paid is $530,268. To Bruce Malkenhorst. He's the former city administrator of Vernon, California. Now, Bruce has an interesting story. He was convicted of misappropriating $60,000 of public monies, taking the public monies for golf games and massages. After his conviction, because of the size of his pension, the media was shining a light on this issue. CalPERS did something that we've never seen happen before. They said, well, we're going to cut your pension down to $120,000. Now, Bruce didn't like that. In fact, in the newspaper, he called it elder abuse. So he's now suing, and until his case is resolved, he will continue to receive $530,268 per year, courtesy of taxpayers. Michael Johnson is a close second. He's a former Solano County administrator. He's earning $371,043 a year. My favorite on the top 10 is a retired city librarian, Anna Martinez. She's getting $234,000 a year. Who said it doesn't pay to know the Dewey Decimal System? Now, when you take a look at each of these top 10 pensions, you don't want to focus on the people as much as you want to focus on how could the system allow someone to walk out with $530,000 a year? How could the system allow a city librarian to walk out with $234,000 a year? It's all legal. It's all based on those formulas and the various tricks and games that are played to do something that we call in the business pension spiking. Spiking that pension, retiring with a lifelong payout. In the city of San Diego, we found some employees receiving 4 separate pension allowances. Individuals, 4 separate pension allowances. That retired city librarian is one of them. She receives a 401k. She receives something called DROP, the Deferred Retirement Option Plan, which I'll talk about in a moment. She receives a regular base pension. And because the pension benefits are so rich that we have violated IRS tax standards, we provide an additional payment to that city librarian from the general fund of the city through a program called Preservation of Benefits. The DROP program. Many cities and states across the country have something called DROP. It's called Deferred Retirement Option Plan. Because we have set our retirement ages so low, age 50, age 55, the government employee unions came along and said, oh, look at the talent we're losing right in the prime of their lives. So we don't want these people to retire. We want to retain them. Age 50 is just too soon for this person to leave our service. We have to allow them to receive their pension and continue to receive a salary. But we'll limit it to 5 years. So DROP has come about in many systems, and this allows city employees and county employees and state employees to retire in place, immediately begin receiving a pension, a full pension, and then they continue to receive their full salary, double dipping. There are some abuses where you see an individual has entered the DROP system, is receiving a salary and a pension from that system, and they are a long-time government employee, and they are already receiving a pension from another government agency. So the sorts of abuses that you see in this Ponzi scheme are breathtaking. And that's why when we went and looked at the actual payouts, the problem continues to be not just the debt and the impact to taxpayers, it's the offensive nature of these payouts. Let's talk a little bit about the accounting gimmicks. We've seen the chorus of people around the country saying pensions are going to be just fine, the stock market will recover. Really, when you look at the numbers, taxpayers need not be worried. Well, again, the pension boards that are producing these numbers, most of these pension boards are dominated by government employees who receive the benefits, employee unions who represent those employees. So there's an inherent conflict of interest in many pension boards across the country. In San Diego, this sort of self-dealing led to a number of charges that were filed against pension administrators. What you're finding is that the pension boards are setting absurdly high return estimates. They're assuming that they're going to get 7.5% or 8% guaranteed return on investment every year. By the way, every year for the next 30 years. Now, I don't know about any of you, but if any of you can guarantee me 7.5%, hey, if you can guarantee me 7% every year for the next 30 years, I'm giving you some money. That's a great investment. It's unheard of. And so they're assuming very high investment returns. They then amortize debt over an absurd period of time, stretching debt payments out over 25, 30 years. Some of them are even saying, well, why don't we push these debt payments back to 40 years? They keep resetting the debt clock and reamortizing the debt, all with an eye towards making that payment as small as possible. Now, why would a board of directors, which has a fiduciary responsibility to the retirees and to taxpayers, why would they intentionally lower the required payment each year? For the same reason that they are also city employees. And they recognize that with a larger pension payment to actually pay the price tag on these benefits would leave less money in the budget for salary increases, for other benefits during the labor negotiations. So there's been an intentional cooking of the books. And then, of course, let's not let the politicians off the hook. They like giving out little favors, and they like giving out programs, and they like increasing budgets for a variety of causes. And if they can find a way to reduce that pension payment and then say, we'll pay it later on, it frees up money for them also to be the good guy, to give out those funds during the year. So we have a number of accounting gimmicks that are used all around the country. Taxpayers really do not know how bad the situation is because these official numbers do not really capture the true size of debt and the true cost of operating state and local government. And finally, there's an amazing abuse of the law where a lot of these pension systems are filing lawsuits against plan sponsors, against taxpayers, are refusing to give information. In the county of San Diego, we reached a real low point in open government when the county pension system refused to respond to one of our coalition data requests, asking for just simply the top payouts. Back in 2003, I started something called the $100,000 Club, where we were publishing the number of individuals that around the state were getting $100,000 pensions. And back in 2003, it was a handful, about 2,000 people. This past year, it's over 30,000 people in the state of California are getting six-figure $100,000 pensions each year. 30,000 government employees. Well, we went to the county of San Diego and made this data request, and they refused. They would not provide the public data, even though it was very clear as day that this is public money. All the other systems were giving up the data, and we had to encourage a lawsuit against the county system just to get data, just to get the information. CalPERS right now is suing the county of San Bernardino on their bankruptcy filing. You see a lot of pension boards that are automatically interpreting the law to allow for disabilities of employees, where government employees come in and they say, I'm disabled. Well, ultimately, the pension system gets to make a determination. Most cases, that goes to the pension board, a subcommittee of the board, for review of the application to make sure that they are truly disabled. But we're seeing an enormous rate of disability approvals by these boards as they use a very liberal standard. And in some cases, it's almost like each of the employees, the heads of the union, say, okay, I'm going to vote for your guy to get disability so that you're voting for my guy on the next time around. So a lot of abuses of the law, not the least of which is a interpretation that you cannot reform pensions. In the city of San Diego, we are currently being sued by the labor unions and the State Public Employee Relations Board, which represents the state on labor disputes. They are claiming that a citizens' initiative, where we went out and gathered signatures for the San Diego Pension Reform Initiative, because we couldn't get it through the city council, that the citizens had an obligation to first ask the permission of the labor unions if they could exercise the right of the initiative. That's the claim that they are making. And so we are fighting a lawsuit from PERB. We ultimately believe we will prevail. A judge in the lower court has said the city has an obligation to implement this measure. The unions have the obligation to prove in court that their claim is correct. And so you have a state agency, PERB, joining with the unions, suing a municipality, suing the people of San Diego for exercising their state and charter constitutional right to petition their government for redress. Abuses of the law. So what did we do in San Diego? Why is it attracting so much attention? Well, the San Diego model is simple. First, we decided to close our defined benefit pension system for the vast majority of our employees. All new hires, with the exception of police, will be mandated to receive a 401k defined contribution retirement. That closes the defined benefit system. It puts our city employees into benefit levels that are no better and no worse than the working taxpayers paying the bill. We actually went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics for San Diego County and determined what is the average contribution by local employers for retirement benefits, and we benchmarked our ballot measure to the penny against what the average taxpayers receive. Second, for existing employees, we are the only ballot measure in the nation that for existing benefits imposes a number of changes and reforms that will affect the ultimate payouts, and we do so legally. We increase the contribution rates of all city employees to the maximum allowable under law, a full contribution. And we also state that investment losses shall be borne by the city employees. And we're going to be hammering that issue out in terms of what the board determines is an investment loss and what is substantially equal. And then finally, we're capping payouts. And we were able to actually take the existing formulas and find a way to cap payouts legally under their contract. First thing we did is that we imposed a very strict definition of what compensation means. What is the highest compensation? We defined it as base salary. No add-ons, no bonus pays, no specialty pays. So from here forward, it shall only be calculated based on the highest base salary, which is substantial. It does produce substantial taxpayer savings. We also capped pension payouts by freezing pensionable pay. And this is something that was kind of remarkable. When I sat down with the lawyers, I said, so can we change the formula? They said, nope, you can't change the formula. They get their years of service times 3% times their highest compensation. I said, well, like any lawyer, the most important part of a document is not just the legal structure of the contract, but the definitions of each of the terms. So I get it that years of service is pretty well defined. The multiplier is what it is, it's 3%. But how do we define this thing called salary? And that's where we opened the door to limiting the definition just to base salary, which we have 100%, and every state and locality out there should be looking at immediately implementing a new definition to disallow anything but the base salary. And then I asked another question, which is, in the pension system, these debt payments are based on an assumed rate of growth in salary. In the city of San Diego, they were assuming a 4.5% to 5.5% increase in salary each year, every year for the next 30 years for each of these employees. I said, wow, that's pretty generous. And the financial guy laughed. He said, sometimes it's not as generous as it should be. I said, well, is there anything in the contract that mandates that I give them 4.5% to 5.5% a year in salary increase? I said, no, but that's of course what you're going to do. And then another lawyer piped up and said, well, nobody would be absurd enough to freeze the salary of government employees. And I said, well, for the purpose of pension calculations, I'm going to freeze the salary of government employees. Let's start out with a 5-year freeze. I'm going to freeze the pensionable pay Now, we're going to allow government employees to get other compensation, merit pay, performance-based pay, even go into longevity pay. But all of those extra pays for recruitment and retention purposes would be deemed not pensionable during the period of the freeze. They scored that reform. And it shaved off hundreds of millions of dollars in the short term, billions if you keep the freeze over the long term. It is the most powerful and legal mechanism to take those debt payments, which are projected to go higher and higher in each year for the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, and flatline, if not reduce them, over that course. It does not violate vested rights, and it's legal. Capping the payouts can be done for existing employees if there's a political will. That's what the San Diego model does. The city of San Jose, at the same time, a Democrat mayor, Mayor Chuck Reed, pursued a ballot measure, and his ballot measure does something slightly different. His ballot measure is currently under legal review because it's not quite certain in case law whether you can do this. I believe he can do this. In our measure, we wrote in language that would allow us to implement the San Jose model. And ultimately, I believe we should implement the San Jose model once it's upheld in court. But what the San Jose model does is it says, I get that your rights are vested up to this point. If this city employee or librarian has worked for 12 years out of 30 years at 2.5% at age 50 or 55, we're going to honor that. You've earned it. You've worked those years. But in year 13, in year 14, in year 15, which you haven't worked yet, we're going to switch you to a defined contribution account. When you retire in 30 years, you will still receive a defined benefit. It will be calculated on your last final salary times your multiplier of 2.5, but it will only include your first 12 years of service. In other words, what they're saying is vested rights are vested up to the year you have actually worked and cannot be taken away from you. But there is no guarantee, there is no assurance that that benefit will be available for years that you were not working and that you have not worked yet, and that the employer, the taxpayer, has a right to change the package. You have a right to leave. Like any employment situation, if you don't like the benefit, you can always go to another employer. There is no vested right for you to continue past this point in a defined benefit plan. I believe that in the vast majority of state and local systems, that will be a reform that's available. But it will require people like Chuck Reed to put that on the table and to understand that a lawsuit will likely be filed for the initial plans and ultimately prevail. The San Diego model saves roughly $1 to $2 billion over the course of the reform, depending upon a number of assumptions you make on performance of the system. Most importantly, it shifts the risk away from taxpayers and, if not equal, entirely onto the backs of the city employees, because it will be a 401k retirement account, and taxpayers will be protected from this sort of accounting games. Defined contribution means that the taxpayer's contribution is capped, and you cannot go back to that taxpayer, cannot go back to that government and demand additional funding later on. And finally, it's fair and equal. It puts city employees and taxpayers in the same benefit package. If it's good enough for the taxpayers footing the bill, it should be good enough for the city employees, the state employees receiving the benefit. So that leads me to the question, what can Congress do? A lot of arguments have been made, particularly federalism arguments that I agree with, that Congress has to respect the rights of the state and local governments to set their compensation packages, that the state constitutions do contain language protecting certain contracted rights, and of course pension benefits and compensation for government employees are part of contracts. But Congress can do what it should have done in 1974 when it passed ERISA. ERISA is the federal law that governs all private sector defined benefit plans. It imposes tough disclosure and management requirements on private sector pensions, and it even provides for a working out process for troubled systems. I believe that to overcome the accounting gimmicks and shell games at state and local pension systems, Congress should and has a full right to protect taxpayers by imposing strong financial disclosure requirements. You're providing information to taxpayers so that they know the true condition, the true financial decisions being made in these pension systems. That is the least that Congress should do. Second, there is a practice in state and local government of issuing pension obligation bonds. POBs were described by one government financial association as like a poker player who has run out of money, who is convinced in this last hand that he's going to win. So he goes out to a loan shark and borrows a substantial sum and decides to go all in with debt. Pension obligation bonds are used by state and local government to bet that they can do better than the market, that they will be able to beat the investment returns, that the debt service is slightly lower, 5% right now, although I would predict with the condition of state and local finances that interest rates on muni bonds will likely creep up, but that they will be able to beat and get positive arbitrage on their pension obligation bonds. Over $65 billion of these POBs have been issued to date, and a number of localities and states are looking at additional pension obligation bonds. These pension obligation bonds have been studied by financial experts. For the past 20 years, they've looked at, one recent study looked at the 20-year cycle of POBs and determined in every case, with the exception of a handful, taxpayers lost paying higher debt payments and carrying higher debt loads as a result because it did not benefit taxpayers. It added to the debt burden. In the county of San Diego, they issued, I believe, $600 billion in pension obligation bonds at the wrong time. They plowed $600 million of debt into their pension system, and then their pension system had several years of poor returns, meaning that you lost your principal and you're still paying the interest on the pension obligation debt that you issued. POBs under the Internal Revenue Code are not taxable. They are taxable, so that by their very nature, the IRS considers these different debt than general obligation debt in state and local governments. I believe Congress ought to discourage POBs, and it has the right. I can't tell you you can't issue a POB because of federalism, but it has a right to amend the Internal Revenue Code to say that a system, a local government that chooses to enter into this sort of debt would lose the tax-free status on their other municipal and state bonds. It would be a bitter pill. And it would certainly draw attention to these pension obligation bonds so that taxpayers would be saying, wait a minute, do we really want to issue this kind of debt where the impact will be higher borrowing costs for a range of projects that we would be issuing through other municipal debt? I think Congress's move on that reform would end the practice of issuance of POBs in our country. It's certainly a practice that should be universally panned and prohibited at the state and local levels. We've been looking at, in San Diego, forcing a public vote on any effort to issue pension obligation debt because we are confident that taxpayers do not want to pay one credit card with another if it were put to a public vote. And finally, the Internal Revenue Code right now is being interpreted to block some reforms. In Orange County, California, in San Diego, we include in our pension reform measure the ability for employees to opt out of higher tier defined benefits into the 401k accounts. In Orange County, they're offering employees the ability to opt out of higher tier defined benefit pensions into lower tier defined benefit pensions. Both of these reforms have now been endorsed by our labor unions. The Orange County Sheriff's Association and the San Diego Police Officers Association have endorsed this opt-out program. Congresswoman Loretta Sanchez, a Democrat from Orange County, is carrying the legislation. It's co-sponsored by her Republican colleagues in Orange County that would clarify the Internal Revenue Code to allow an opt-in, opt-out period for every public sector pension program, provided that they're going from a higher tier to a lower tier. The IRS has not given an opinion letter to San Diego or Orange County allowing us to do this. And I believe that there are a lot of government employees that would like to save money on their pension contributions. We're now charging the full cost of the pension. That means there's less take-home pay out of each employee's paycheck because they're actually paying the full price for their portion of the contribution. And there are a lot of employees that will voluntarily opt out of higher tiers into lower tiers to get more take-home pay. That's good for the employee. It's good for the taxpayer. And all we need is that clarification in the Internal Revenue Code. These are 3 reforms that Congress could implement that respects the right of states and localities to manage their affairs, but would provide substantial protection to taxpayers. ERISA changes so that we impose full disclosure on state and local pension programs on financial issues. A modification of the Internal Revenue Code as it relates to state and local debt to really discourage the use of POBs. Still allowed, but it would be heavily discouraged. And finally, clarifying the Internal Revenue Code to allow for state and local pension systems to offer an opt-out program for employees wishing to go from a high tier to a low tier to save money for taxpayers and to save money for the employees. This can be bipartisan. As I mentioned, Loretta Sanchez is carrying legislation, or has carried legislation in the prior Congress to allow the opt-in, opt-out program. That's received Republican co-sponsors. Devin Nunes has carried legislation to impose disclosure requirements on pension systems. That's worthy. In San Jose, a Democrat mayor, along with a Democrat council, placed their pension reform measure on the ballot. In San Diego, we collected our signatures. We collected over 145,000 citizen signatures to qualify the ballot measure. A third came from Republicans, a third from Democrats, a third from independents. When we looked at the tally of votes on election night, we won every council district and every political party and every socioeconomic group. To their credit, our council, even the members that opposed the proposition, came together just weeks after the voters approved it, and on a unanimous bipartisan vote, began implementation. And so we took the first steps of implementing our 401k retirement program in August. To a credit to our labor unions, they came to a unanimous agreement with us on the terms and conditions of those 401k accounts. We still have disagreements. The labor unions are still challenging elements of our measure. But I am really heartened to see a bipartisan commitment to implementing pension reform. Governor Brown in California pushed through legislation in August that, while it doesn't fix the problem, takes some good steps towards solving the problem, and received a tremendous number of Democrat votes in the California Senate and California Assembly. This can be bipartisan. It certainly is wildly popular to the voters when they see these payouts, when they see their services cut, when they see the size of the debt and the size of the annual payments. Even Democrats sit back and say, well, what can we do with that extra money? And Republicans, of course, are very interested in seeing reform of these sorts of programs. So we can make this a bipartisan issue if we continue to look at building those sorts of coalitions. With that, I'll entertain any questions. I'd be happy to talk about the political challenges we had, the opposition from the unions, how we overcame that in the campaign. But I wanted to get those policy issues out on the table and really, hopefully, leave you with confidence that despite the chorus of opponents of pension reform who say that these are all vested benefits that are set in stone, San Diego, San Jose, other systems are showing that yes, you can reform these benefits, and that we must reform these benefits if we're going to prevent the pension tsunami from wiping out all of our state and local services across the country.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'm going to take the prerogative, the moderator's prerogative of asking the first question. Then we'll open it up to Q&A from all of you. Mine is I guess, a political or process question, which will be illustrated with an anecdote. You spoke a little bit about some abuses of disability benefits. Montgomery County, right outside of D.C., notorious for that. Much, much higher rates of disability, police and firemen than in adjoining counties. And there's a story that this is maybe a year ago in the Washington Post talking about the Montgomery County efforts to get on top of this. There's a fellow I know who's a member of the county council, a Democrat and not a moderate Democrat, but a fairly liberal one. But he had voted in favor of some reforms of the process for handling disability applications. And according to the Washington Post, at one of the meetings, a head of the Public Employees Union went up to him and said, "You're a one-termer, pal." The dynamics of it is at the local level, at city level, at the state level, often public employee unions are much more focused than the citizen at large. California and San Diego, you had the advantage of working with the ballot initiative process, where you can go over the ins and outs of the kind of the day-to-day political process, go directly to the people, say, what do you think on this, have a vote. How applicable are these reforms, do you think, to systems where you have to work through the regular order, where you can't bypass the political structures and you have to work with them? How do you think you can work these reforms outside of California in Ohio or New York or Rhode Island or other places that are thinking about reform?
That's a great question, because it is it's the real challenge that we're going to face in getting these reforms implemented. As commonsensical as they are, as widespread the support is among the public for pension reform, when you finally get it to the legislative branches of state and local government, it's very difficult to actually get the votes. I will tell you right now that the opposition I faced in San Diego in the mayor's race, millions of dollars spent by organized labor, was driven directly by my leadership on pension issues. And as we were going through the campaign, when I launched it in the winter of 2011, I put out a statement. And I was very clear as to what I was doing. I said, if running for mayor helps us implement the fiscal reforms the city must implement, then absolutely I will consider doing it and will pursue it. And I knew that if I could get pension reform done in San Diego, it didn't matter what else I was able to do, because I dedicated myself to solving this problem. It's why I ran for office. I didn't want to sell my companies in 2007 and become a politician. I just got so fed up and frustrated with the members of the city council not dealing with this issue. And I thought by recruiting some like-minded council candidates in 2008 that we would be able to take a majority and be able to implement pension reform. Well, 2008 wasn't such a good year. I got elected, and I turned around and I realized, okay, there's no one else with me. I was on a 2-6 minority on the city council. A 2-6 minority. 4 months into my term, we were able to get an 8-0 vote on the city council for our first labor contract, which, among other things, required full contributions through the labor contracts for city employees for their pensions. 8-0 vote. And so it's possible. But you do need to have that public engagement. And so a lot of my time was spent on the council, not just introducing ideas, recognizing that in the first reading or the first consideration of those ideas, my colleagues would pan them, but going out to the public through a series of town halls and public appearances and really trying to light the fire. Politicians don't see the light until they feel the heat. And that's where you need to have outside groups, activist groups, citizen groups, the media, and some courageous individual legislators that are willing to go out and be that leader. In Orange County, it was John Morlock, the county supervisor. If it weren't for John Morlock, one voice on that county board, we would not have seen the county or the Orange County pension reform model. And then, of course, Chuck Reed's leadership, a Democrat in San Jose, would not have gotten the San Jose measure without Chuck Reed. And so it does, never underestimate the power of one individual to really drive an issue. But I do recognize, and the unions kind of made the case nationwide when they were trying to canvass their colleagues for money for San Diego, and the millions of dollars that were pouring in, the ads that they ran, the canvassers that they put on the street in the election. They were making the point that if we can defeat this guy in San Diego, we'll send a message to people out across the country. Don't try pension reform. The happiest point was when we got that pension initiative passed by the voters in San Diego, and I would do it all over again in a heartbeat.
We'll work with questions now. We have microphones going around. If you could identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, and all questions should be short and end with a question mark. Sure. Okay. Actually, why don't we go with the mic so then we can pick it up on the video as well.
Hazel Bradford with pensions, and I have a lot of questions. But let's start with the last point. Are you going to take this on the road now? What are you going to do?
I'm 3,000 miles away from my home. I think I'm on the road.
Well, but you're preaching to the choir right today.
Oh, no, we got some good public sector union representatives here in the audience, and I know that they will present a counter view from what we're talking about today. But yes, we do need to take this on the road. This is a story that has to be told. It's just at the cusp of public awareness, even though in some areas like San Diego, it's been around for several years. We really haven't seen the sort of action by state and local officials to get this done. That's why the ERISA changes for Congress are so critical. People say, well, it's just information. Never underestimate transparency. To shine a light on a problem, to really disclose how underfunded these pensions are, the sort of accounting gimmicks, that reform alone puts a lot of pressure on state and local leaders to act, to do something about the crisis.
Well, and that does lead me to the next question, which is federal. The 3 points that you mentioned. What are the prognosis for?
You know, when I came to San Diego and started looking at pensions in 2003, had you come up to me and said, you know, and within 9 years, Carl, you're going to privatize pensions in the city of San Diego, I would have laughed. I would have settled for far less reform than we actually have been able to accomplish. So I know a lot of people say that this is going to be a hard battle. It's not going to get done because of the power of organized labor and government unions. Take the long view. Because guess what? The math is on your side. You can't sustain these pensions, and so the heat is going to get hotter and hotter. And reform will be easier as you build the case. So start now, take the long view. We may not get this legislation through Congress this cycle. You may not get pension reform measures through legislatures. Right now, Florida is considering a pension reform measure. Virginia yesterday, the Speaker of the Virginia Assembly announced his intention to pursue a 401k style retirement program for state employees. It may not happen in one legislative assembly term, but build the case and push forward. The unions did an excellent job over the past 15, 20 years. Each labor contract in each municipality in each state sweetening the benefits little by little to where now they're completely unsustainable. Reformers have to take the same approach of each pass. In San Diego, we passed a pension reform initiative in 2006 to require all future pension benefits be put to a public vote. People said, okay, Carl, are you done now? I said, no. That just kind of puts a safety valve in place. In 2009, I joined in support of a negotiated settlement on pensions for the labor contract that year that gave a haircut, slightly reduced white-collar and blue-collar pension formulas, defined benefit formulas. They said, are you done now? I said, no. I support it for this labor contract. We all ought to be proud of this, but more is going to have to happen. So with each cycle, we can get reform done, and that needs to be the playbook for reformers across the country.
I'm sure he.
I'll do an interview afterwards since I know you're writing a story.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Carl. Hank Kim with the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Thank you for your presentation. How do you respond to recent reports out of San Diego that by closing the DB plan and switching to a 401k, it's actually increasing costs because of the transition costs? particularly in light of the fact that over the last handful of years, 40 states have made reforms to their pension plans to make it sustainable without actually closing their plans.
Yeah, it's not true. It depends upon how you call it cost. Let me explain a couple of things. First, our pension measure produces immediate savings because we lock into place the full contributions for city employees, which is valued at roughly $28 million for our workforce, $28 million a year. The unions have taken the position that those full contributions are temporary concessions that eventually they're going to want to see back. Our proposition permanently requires full contributions by city employees saving $28 million a year. Second, our implementation of the pension pay freeze saves money immediately. In fact, the pension board, knowing that Prop B was passing, changed their assumptions to lower growth in employee salaries, thus lowering our annual pension payment. Prop B produces savings there. Third, when you take a look at what they're claiming is increased costs, it's actually the pension board has decided to require us to pay our debts on time. Right now, the pension board amortizes debts over a very long period of time. They're trying to give wiggle room, relieve pressure on the city's budget, so more money is available for day-to-day salaries, day-to-day spending. When we moved and closed the system, they said, wait a minute, you're closing the system, we want our money quick. Give us our money now. Speed it up. And so as a result, what they're calling cost is actually paying our debt off faster, which, because you're being charged 7.5% interest on accrued debt annually, actually saves money because you're paying down the debt quicker, just like when you pay down your mortgage quicker. It's actually something that every fiscally responsible person should support, which is we should be requiring these pension systems to pay their debt on a timely basis, not this elongated, stretched out period that they've all adopted.
Well, and that's because, and I think the folks from the actuarial world can explain it a lot better than I can, but it's because an open system, you have new participants coming in, whereas with the closed system, you don't have new participants coming in. That's why the payments are expedited.
Well, I could see the logic if you were a private sector pension plan in that sort of accounting assumption. But the city of San Diego is perpetual. The city of San Diego is perpetual, and we are going to continue to make our pension payments in full.
For what it's worth, I wrote a piece for AEI about the transition cost issues. There's a longer piece written by Bob Costrell, who's an economist at the University of Arkansas, also dealing with this. And I think that, I guess the point I would make is, one is, it's an accounting convention from GASB in terms of how quickly you'd amortize your unfunded liabilities. The idea of the transition cost issue comes, it's sort of ironic in the sense that the argument essentially would be the bigger your unfunded liabilities are, the harder it is to switch to a defined contribution plan, which doesn't create new unfunded liabilities. As it turns out, there's no legal requirement in terms of the speed at which you amortize your unfunded liabilities. States can and have altered that, and there's no policy reason to do it as well. You still have the same amount of money coming into the government, the same amount of money going out. And I think under the revised GASB rules that will be coming into place, I think even then the transition cost argument or the amortization period gets sort of standardized or shortened. So I think it's just, at the end of the day, it's sort of, I think that's
yeah, but I think we really have to challenge their language, how they're trying to frame the debate. The unions want you to call this a transition cost. It's not a transition cost. We're paying down our debt faster. In San Diego, they kept pushing the debt payments back. In fact, there were several years they skipped the pension payment altogether, which got us into even bigger trouble. Voters were appalled, and so they passed Proposition H in 2004. I supported that because I said we have to make sure that they don't cook the book and kick the can down the field. That required a 15-year amortization schedule. Well, the pension board decided to disagree with the voters, and they adopted at first a 20-year amortization schedule and then compromised to 17 years. Hey, we're paying down our debts faster. Taxpayers benefit. And the unions don't want to do that because that's more money out of the general budget each year, because we're getting to that point where we're actually meeting our debt obligations for the pension system.
Okay, I understand you want to engage. We should give other people a turn. Yes, sir.
Paul Edwards. I'm editor of Deseret News in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm curious, from a journalistic perspective, how the press has covered issues of pension abuse and so on during this fiscal crisis in California and in San Diego. And if they haven't covered it well, what would be the toolkit that you would recommend for reporters that are interested in doing a deep look at these kind of issues of abuse?
How does the press cover the issues? Well, early on, the press mentioned some of the things that happened. And now, some of those members of the media are trying to point to small little stories, a line in one story in 96 or 2002 and say, oh, no, we covered it. Come on, guys. You need the big spotlight. And so early on, I do fault the media for not banging the drum loud enough, for not being that watchdog, not being vigilant. Recently, that's changed. And I think it's because members of the media have recognized how their viewers and their readers are so upset by what's going on. The $100,000 Club studies that I produce are huge hits in the media because people love opening up the paper and reading, the librarian is getting what this year? $234,000? So there's been more attention, more coverage by the media. I would like the media to challenge kind of the terminology that the unions use. I don't think there's enough truth testing. And remember, the unions sold taxpayers and elected officials a bill of goods early on. All the claims they made have proved to be false. Particularly the claim that if you don't spike pension benefits, we're going to lose good city and county employees. City of San Diego, with our pension measure, compared to the governor's plan for police officers, we actually offer better benefits than the governor's recently approved pension plan. Actually will make our police department, in my opinion, more competitive in the search for talent. So I'm hopeful that the media not only will continue to cover the payouts, but will truth test and challenge statements by the unions. There's this guy over here talking about increased costs for transition costs. No, you're paying your debt down quicker. You're paying more of your principal off. We call that financially responsible. These systems are under billions of dollars in debt, and the idea that you're going to pay off your debt a little quicker to save interest is actually a good thing for taxpayers given how big of a ditch we're in. So a little bit more challenge by the unions on the union rhetoric would be helpful. And hey, I'm willing to be challenged as well as I have.
Yes, sir.
Don First with the American Academy of Actuaries. Thank you, Carl, for this discussion. It's illuminating. Many of the problems that you've identified with respect to the plans, things like spiking and early retirement and very generous formulas, many of them are the result of what I would describe as poor governance on these plans. Decision makers who are conflicted and things. And yet, most of the solutions that you've proposed go to the symptoms, preventing spiking, preventing generous formulas, and having more disclosure. What have you done to really correct some of the problems with governance, the structure of boards, the people that make the decisions, and how these things change? What changes are you urging in the governance of these plans?
That's a great question. First and foremost, and this is why I don't address this on the federal side, but I believe every state and local government ought to pass an ordinance or an initiative to mandate that pension boards be free of all conflicts of interest, that they be taxpayer representatives only. In San Diego, we enacted a partial reform in 2004 that said that we had to have a majority of members appointed as taxpayer representatives. The unions, I believe, still get 5 or 6 slots on that board. So it's a divided board. Enacting governance reforms is critical, and I think that is still on the table in San Diego. It certainly needs to be on the table in California. CalPERS, for example, took the governor's bill, which ostensibly talked about ending pension spiking by using base regular salary, And on Friday, they announced, to many people's shock, I wasn't too surprised given the past misdeeds of the board, they announced that regular base earnings includes bonus pays, specialty pays, add-on pays. So in other words, they gutted the entire reform. I believe that their determination could be subject to litigation and in court thrown out, and that would protect taxpayers if that were done. So there are challenges of governance that we have to address. But at the federal level, I don't think it's the Congress's right or responsibility to dictate who's being appointed to state and local pension boards. We have to make that reform happen at the state and local level. We've done part of it in San Diego. We need to finish the job.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Tom Donlan from Barron's Magazine. San Diego municipal finances have been a widely publicized mess for about 2 decades. California as a whole, and many municipalities the same. In other words, your community hit the wall early, and that seemed to arouse a public awareness of the issue. In states and cities where nobody has hit the wall, where the accounting continues to show no problems, can you think of any community that has actually made a pension reform without hitting a wall first?
You know, pain is what drives change. And I think in some of these systems we need to see a bit more pain before you're going to see the awareness and the commitment to reform. That's why when people say, okay, well, the Congress would require disclosure of the financial condition of the systems, that transparency helps build the case as to why this is painful. And that's a critical part of what Congress can do, a very easy step that can have a profound impact on building the case. But I do believe that as we see more and more cuts, as more and more schools are closed, as fire stations are browned out, as library hours are cut, as streets aren't repaved, you're going to see more and more communities recognize that there is a real and lasting impact of the pension tsunami in their community and that they need to enact reform.
Another question? Yes, sir. Right. Can we get a mic, please?
This is Jordan Marks from the National Public Pension Coalition. The changes that you ushered in the cuts that you made in San Diego have a very real impact. Your workers in San Diego, your trash truck drivers, your firemen, they don't receive Social Security, right? So the city doesn't pay in your 6.2%, workers don't pay in. It's easy to sort of pick out maybe your $100,000 example, but that's not the average pension in San Diego.
Can I talk about the average?
Well, if I'll just finish,
sure.
And I'd love to hear. But so the average pension is modest, and workers have put their life savings into these plans, right? Governments, San Diego decided not to pay in over many years. That created kind of the problem that we're in. But without Social Security, if you take away a trash truck driver, a fireman, a healthcare worker's pension, that's modest. You'll leave them in poverty. The other point I wanted to ask about is, you talk about the retirement age. God willing, I can do my job until I'm 67, and God willing, you can do yours. We sit behind a desk, perhaps, right? But you can't chase a trash truck until you're 65 years old, right? You can't run into a burning building at 60 years old. You just simply cannot. And so I would like you to address some of the human impact this has on your middle-class workers in San Diego.
Let me take the second part of the question first. We've always presumed that when, for example, a firefighter gets to the age where they simply cannot continue to do the heavy physical work of the job, that we would have a reemployment program for other positions. There are a lot of different positions that are done in local government, in state government. And that's an opportunity for us to examine how can we continue to use those folks so that we can continue their employment. But I also point out, when we were doing the ballot measure, we were having people sign. The firefighters' unions stood out front of the stores trying to block people from signing. And there was an interesting interplay between citizens and these government employees talking about pensions and what's right, what's fair. lady who looked a little older comes up. She's like, I want to sign that ballot measure. And a firefighter stepped forward and said, ma'am, you don't want to do that. I'm a firefighter. Don't you know that I have to run into burning buildings? I have to lift heavy people. And I can't work past age 50. That's why I need this sort of benefit. She looked him straight in the eye. And she said, son, I'm an emergency room nurse. I'm 58. I lift heavy people every day. Give me the pen, I'm signing. And so I get it, it's an analogy. But I think that there are a lot of government employees who haven't been in the private sector, may not have the sort of point of reference. So when they get very animated and say, this isn't fair, I can't possibly do this, they may not be speaking from the experience that many taxpayers have in terms of their retirement systems, their compensation, their workload. Let me address the first issue. This concept, and you're going to get this across the country, where unions say, well, the average retiree gets X. Be very careful about the numbers they're throwing around. In the city of San Diego, what they do is they take all government employees retired since the beginning of the system, and they come up with an average. So you'll have a lot of employees that retired in 1985 who are receiving, and I would agree, modest defined benefit pensions, very modest. And they lump them in to lower the average with the people who are retiring in 2010, 2011, 2012. So I think it's real important for you to perhaps do a study on what's the average pension payout for individuals who retired in the last 12 months. You'll be shocked. It's a dramatically different figure than the unions are going to give you in their talking points. We decided in 2009 to do a study commissioned by the Mercer actuarial firm of white and blue-collar pensions, not the public safety, police and fire pensions, which tend to be much more generous, but blue-collar, white-collar trash truck drivers, for example. And we asked Mercer, if someone worked for 30 years, how much would they receive? What do you think the figure was of their final salary? What percent? Percent of final salary that they would receive if they retired at the age of Social Security for life. 30 years of service. 60%? 80%? 129% of highest salary for life. So yes, let's talk average. I think if you did a poll, and we've done some polls of California and San Diego, and you ask people, what is the highest percent of the final salary that you think a government employee should receive when they retire for the rest of their life? Our polling shows that the vast support is 65%. 65%. So let's have the discussion on averages, but let's use accurate numbers. Let's drill down and ask, what does an employee get of their highest last salary? Dramatic number. Let's talk about Social Security. So in San Diego, we are exempted from the Social Security system. I would venture to guess that, I'll make a deal right now. If our employees, I'll write the check right now for Social Security, for those employees, if they let us off the hook on the defined benefits. I'll tell you right now that employees won't take that deal because their benefits are far greater than the Social Security benefits they would have accrued. The Social Security question we address in our ballot measure. What we say is employees get to decide whether they want to re-enroll in Social Security or whether they want to take the exact amount we would have contributed to Social Security into a private annuity plan, privately insured, defined benefit payout plan. And of course, during the campaign, our union said that they hated this idea. It's awful. Well, the initiative passes. We then have the actuary sit down and model what they would receive if they stay out of Social Security, and they took the 6.2% that we would have written should they enroll in Social Security and give it to them in a private account. The unions changed their position, and several of them wrote letters to the governor opposing a bill that would require that government employees re-enroll in Social Security because they saw the financial benefit in having the 6.2% in a private account every year for 30 years. We benchmarked our contribution, by the way, on exactly what local employers in San Diego County give their employees. 9.2%. It's a 6.2% contribution for the employer share of Social Security and a 3% average contribution for the 401k. Fair. Equal. What's good for the taxpayer should be good for the government employee. I don't want our employees to be thrown under the bus. I'm a businessman. I want to provide good services to our community. In order to do that, I have to recruit and retain quality employees. I shouldn't overcompensate because that's wasteful, and that means I can't hire another employee to do something equally important in the community. That's why we chose the standard of benchmarking to the penny, cost of retirement benefits for city employees and the local labor market. It works.
Yes, sir.
I'm Lee Snell with the National Council on Teacher Retirement. To that very point you just made, Carl, do you think that the private sector employees in San Diego have enough set aside? Are they well prepared for retirement? What's their retirement security status?
Yeah, this is another question that relates to one of the arguments that government employees are now using. And in the state of California, you'll be shocked to hear that the legislature passed and the governor signed a bill setting up a government pension program for private sector employees. What they're trying to do is take the argument I just made, which is it's no better, no worse than what the private sector gives, no better, no worse than what the taxpayers receive. And what they're saying is, golly, that's a pretty solid argument. This fairness or equality argument is pretty solid. So what we need to do is we need to boost the retirement requirements, pension requirements for businesses, for their employees. So if we spike those, then we can continue this race to the top. It's very similar to the arguments they made within government by saying, hey, San Bernardino just spiked their pensions for their firefighters. If San Diego doesn't spike your pensions, then we're going to lose all of our firefighters to San Bernardino because they get a better deal. So we've seen this sort of logic used before. And it's important for us not to fall into that trap because I believe that that is kind of where the argument is going by the government unions to protect these benefits. That being said, we all have to be looking at how can we create a more prosperous economy so that people can afford to live in San Diego, that they can afford to send their kids to college, so they can afford to retire comfortably. And that's where I think instead of adding mandates to the picture, we ought to be saying, how do we create more jobs? How do we create a better economy? And one of the things that doesn't create a good economy is a government that's on the brink of bankruptcy. Businesses do not want to be in unstable environments where they think the city of San Diego may go bankrupt, where the schools are going to be bad for the children of their employees, where the local education system won't produce quality employees that will allow their company to recruit and retain employees to make them competitive. It's all interrelated, I think, to the main fundamental challenge, which is creating a prosperous economy locally. In order to do that, you have to make sure that the local government is financially secure. Pension reform is absolutely critical to making sure you achieve that status.
I appreciate that answer, but I don't think I heard the answer to my question, though, which is if you're bringing the public sector down to where the private sector is, then I would hope that where the private sector is at some place that provides adequate security, because if it's not, then you're not really improving anybody's retirement security, and I would think that ultimately the price for that will end up falling on government, because if people don't have enough in retirement to live on, and I think the Washington Post that I had an interesting article about DC Plan's ability to provide for that, at some point someone has to pick up that cost, I would think, unless we're simply going to let people go homeless and have inadequate. So with that, I'd just like to understand, again, do the private employees in San Diego have enough for retirement, and how does this reform help them?
Right. The program that we put in place, we worked with actuaries and retirement specialists, and we said, well, what is the gold standard of what we want to accomplish for these employees by retirement? And they said roughly 65, 67, maybe 70%, depending upon the individual's spending and living habits upon retirement. And our pension initiative achieves that standard. So we sat down with the experts, retirement planners, and said, what do we need to be able to achieve? And guess what? That's benchmarked right to the private sector model. So the question becomes, are employers, are employees doing what they need to do to hit those targets? And that's where I think a lot of these financial literacy programs are critically important to make sure that not only do we have a robust economy, but that we are making sure that people know you got to start saving. You got to make sure you're putting aside this percentage each year because you want to be able to retire comfortably. So it's a two-step process. It's making sure that they have jobs, that we have a vibrant economy, and that we have financial literacy. And I'm a big supporter in these financial literacy programs, which have a huge impact on encouraging these good behaviors and encouraging the sorts of savings and investments that we need over the course of time to achieve those standards. The City of San Diego measure achieves the standards set by the financial planners.
I think we can. I think we actually have to wrap it up now. But anyway, I'd like to thank Carl very much, and I hope you'll join me in thanking him for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.